Hi, everybody. Welcome to, where are we? November the 12th. We have got past the elections. We have made it to the other side, and it is a great pleasure to introduce you to Suchitra Matai. Thank you, Suchitra, for agreeing to be in conversation with me.
Of course, my pleasure.
No, it's fantastic. And I think we're at like 16 attendees now. So just by way of a short introduction, I'm not going to read Suchitra's bio because you've all got that. That's how you got to here in the first place. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the phenomena that is Suchitra. Because she and I have had many conversations, and it's one of these conversations have happened over time, and Suchitra has had to hold on to her hat because she has risen in terms of curators looking at her practice and thinking with and through her practice with her very dramatically in the last couple of years. And in fact, this year she's had 11 shows, 4 of which are solo exhibitions. And it was interesting. There's a critic called Ben Davis. He did an article for Art News in September, and he did a kind of survey of 200 museums and what they were showing in September, and did a kind of report of 5 artists who were in more museums than any other, thinking through what does that mean for curatorial zeitgeist? You know, is there a way of trying to kind of understand it? Is there a curatorial zeitgeist? And could it be understood as being reflected in the exhibitions? So Suchitra was one of the people that he spoke about, and I thought that was an interesting approach to kind of understanding what's happening. And of course, this brings many many interesting factors for artists. You know, it's incredible to be, you know, on a stage and be somebody who is being looked at by lots of curators. It's also an awful lot of work. So I'm really excited, Suchitra, that you're going to take us through some of those recent exhibitions, and, you know, after explaining your practice a little bit. And as ever, those of you who are listening in, if you use the Q&A, put your questions into there, then I can read them out in the process of this conversation. I don't think Suchitra is somebody that needs to wait until the end for all the questions unless we get on a roll. And raise your hand if it seems like I'm not paying attention to the administration of this. So this is being recorded, so I think you've all accepted the recording. And without further ado, I'd love to hand it over to you, Suchitra.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you, SVA, for having me. I hope my work lives up to Kate's bio there that she's created. Yeah, I'm happy to be here, and I'm going to go over just a brief sort of introduction of really the last 7 years. Don't worry, not like a very brief introduction of the last 7 years, and then just focus on the 4 solos from this year because they've all been very different. And, I'm excited to share them and also the approach and planning and conceptual framework behind each. So I have a very sort of, I should say, strange background as an artist, but I think all artists have strange backgrounds. I studied many different things before I had the courage to be an artist. And it was until about 7, 8 years ago that I had a rebirth in my practice. And I decided to shed every preconceived notion of what I thought art was and what it could be. And I really looked to storytelling as sort of primal, the force behind the work, and particularly telling the stories of my family and ancestors. And when I thought about doing this, I really thought, well, what is the best way to do this? Is it through, is it through painting? Is there a particular medium? Is there, how are there archives I can look at? How do I do this? And I realized it was all of the above. And I started thinking about a process that was more call and response. So I use a lot of found objects in my work. This is an image from the Sharjah Biennial a number of years ago, 2019. And that's actually where I met Kate. And I wanted to have a work that combined many different, not just materials, but sort of had both the intimate and a kind of macro and a micro look at borders and the relationship of borders to the individual. I won't go on about it, but in terms of material, I first started using worn saris as a kind of major material in my work. And what they brought to the practice was a sense of the body, of intimacy. It was a way of telling my own migration story, and also a way of connecting, women of the South Asian diaspora, over topography through time. And so I started experimenting and making, works of different scales. I am trained as a painter, but I feel as though, and I do feel that painting is at the heart of a lot of what I do. But I find that there are no limits. I think as artists, we think in different languages, different visual languages, and different visual materials. So I allow myself that sense of play and experimentation to be a major or a driving force actually in my work. So intuition and whatnot. So actually from the Sharjah Biennial, the tapestries of course became really worn, really, they were direct to the sun. Some of them, they crumbled. And I used those parts of those to weave into what I called newer worn saris to create this sort of landscape that I called Exodus. And so over the years, I've been experimenting with, using finding the figure within these tapestries. I should say the practice of weaving, as I use quotations because it's not really weaving. From my grandmothers, I learned at a very young age, they were Caribbean, Indo-Caribbean, and sewed their own clothes. My one grandmother was a professional seamstress. And so I really wanted to kind of use all of these tools that I had that I learned from them in the work, and it became more personal, but I also wanted to be inventive. And so in using the saris, what I do is I cut them into strips, and then I weave them back and forth, almost like embroidery, into a net, a gridded net. And so that's the process from those. But it has been really important to me to sort of honor them and to use those practices.
Could you say a little bit about the scale of the ones that we've
Oh,
just
yeah.
looked?
Yeah. So, sorry. This one is 10 feet by 15 feet. And
Mhm.
Exodus was, I think, a 42 feet by 15 feet. There's always something about monumentality that's been, how do you, when we think of a lot of craft-based processes, there's a kind of scale that we think in. And I know more and more artists are, expanding that scale. And there's something about bringing attention to those practices at that scale that to me celebrates, women of the domestic and all these practices in a different way.
Mhm.
But I
So
use lots of
when you're
oh,
talking about the
mhm.
net is like, what's the kind of gap that you're weaving through? Again, just to get a kind of feeling of this.
Yeah, so the net is a 1 inch by 1 inch grid sometimes, and a 7/8 by 7/8 inch grid sometimes. So quite small, and it allows for the freedom to work in different widths and to combine different widths. But as you can imagine, having organic forms within the grid was a challenge at first, but it's become, of course, like any medium, it becomes well practiced.
Mhm.
But yeah, I've made, this is made of salt and other materials. And I mentioned I use a lot of found objects. I'm really interested in objects that um, uh, kind of hearken to a colonial period, specifically the colonial period that my family lived through. Um, in post when slavery ended in the Caribbean, um, the British looked in British colonies looked to India being their biggest colony for workers, indentured servants to come to indentured laborers to come to Guyana to work the sugar plantations. And so my family, for generations on some sides and less generations on the other side, were, embroiled in that process. And so using, these found objects, it's a little hard to see here, but there's a found bust. And uh, they kind of speak to a certain era. I often use, I'm just going to skip ahead. See if I have one of these. I guess I didn't put one in the beginning. I often use tapestries that have a very pastoral European scene. And then I will go in and do a sort of what I call a brown reclamation within that scene. And so the figures become, South Asian, their saris are become intertwined with the other materials. And, I mentioned that I use a lot of different scales. So you can see in this exhibition from Roberts Projects last year, I started creating these sculptures, hanging sculptures that are called phala. And they are made of braided saris. And so they also harken back to the idea of early American rug braiding and using like waste and recycling. But I'll talk more about those as I go on. But beading, embroidery, found clothing help me to tell stories. And so this is actually one of those found tapestries that I then sort of went into and embroidered and beaded and used bindis and all sorts of materials to create a brand new story.
When you say found,
Mhm.
where are you finding this stuff?
That is a good, I should say found and sourced. My favorite way to find an object is if I'm in a vintage store or Goodwill or something like that, and then something just speaks to me. That's the best way. Usually when I find something like that, I want to make something immediately. So I take it back to my studio and work on it. Other times I might know I have an idea, a vision for something else, for something specific, and then I will search for a tapestry that has, imagery with children or something like that.
Mhm. Can I just ask one question about the salt?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
and this is made of salt, and then you went by. So before we lose the opportunity, it's hard to see on that image. Can you explain the, because it's
So
obviously fabric as well as salt, right?
it's a number of things. So it's actually fabricated like 3D printed from wood. But it also it's plaster, made of plaster and salt mixed together. And I called it osmosis. I wanted it to have that sense of the sea, almost like it's like a broken shikara from a temple. And and then there's salt, of course, on the floor and fiber that falls from it.
Yeah, it's very beautiful. That's the first time you've seen something that's kind of mainly focused on the sculptural element and like left the wall completely.
Yeah, yeah. This work 2022. Yeah, it was in 2022.
Mhm.
And then sort of this is an exhibition that I had called Breathing Room in Boise, in Idaho. During the pandemic, I couldn't go to see it, but this is a shot of it. But just kind of looking at the various off the wall, on the wall sort of relationships of the objects that I
And
use.
that's a boat in the air?
Boat. It's a boat.
Is that a real boat, or that's a boat that you made?
It's a real boat.
Hmm.
And the materiality, you know, again, brings me such a kind of thriving language, and I'm always trying to expand on the materials that I use. But Gunguru bells, I grew up in a family of dancers, and I tried to study dance myself. I was terrible. I should say that my mother made me try to study dance, but I did classical dance, Bharatanatyam. And so I wanted to have sort of this ode. There's kind of an underlying sort of post-colonial bent and an underlying, you know, power, empowering of women, and whatnot within the work. So going the wrong way. So the four sort of solo projects, exhibitions that I had this year. The first one that opened was called "We Are Nomads, We Are Dreamers," and you know, I grew up partially on the East Coast in New Jersey, and I was there from like 12 to 21, and I had so much family in Queens. And so when Caitlin came to me with this project, I just saw so much potential in it. The idea of doing something outside with textiles, I always like to take risks and challenges like this. And then the idea that it was in a park that people were actually using, the whole thing just made me so excited. Of course, you know, I wanted to create some kind of ode to the immigrant experience, because there's so many immigrants in Queens, and Socrates being on the East River and feeding into the Atlantic Ocean was of course important too, given that the Atlantic was wasn't the major, you know, ocean that my family had migrated or had forced migration on. Um, so when I started thinking about the project, I wanted the sculptures to be have both reference to land and to body. And so I grew up also in Nova Scotia, and I would see all of these glacial deposits as we drive into the country. And I wanted to create these forms that felt tectonic, almost like artifacts from the future, but to also have that sense of warmth and body and textile and, you know, that sort of domestic aspect to them. I think of the saris as having kind of a direct reference to women's labor, because the saris I use for these larger projects are all sort of everyday saris, not the ones that are for rituals and whatnot. And the mirrored stainless steel tops allowed the installation to be forever changing, and to have this element of the park sort of embedded within it. And so there was, you know, people were always interacting with them. They're very large. The
It's
trees would
incredible in
sway.
relation to the buildings, like
Yeah.
that New York landscape, because this is, Socrates Sculpture Park sitting in a fairly, I mean, it's upcoming. There's more people living there, but it's a fairly remote area of Queens traditionally, isn't it? It's like, but
Yes.
to
Yes.
get back to that
Totally.
image where you see the one before there, that's like, it's so interesting looking at the relationship of the forms to what's around both nature and the urban environment.
Yes. Yes. Definitely. They feel architectural, in a way, because of their scale and the interaction. I also, because it's Socrates and the natural world is like their focus, and because I wanted to do something that, you know, sort of harness that energy of the natural world. We actually had a garden that included both tropical flowers, but also healing elements like turmeric and mint and whatnot, so that this could be a place of healing. I called it Becoming, because when I thought of monuments, I mean, we think of monuments, of course, we think of these sort of stagnant, large, sort of odes to men, mostly, and heroes. And I wanted to create a kind of monument to the sense of, with the sense of transformation, or to this process of transformation. So in that light, it had to have changes happening at all times. And so over the course of the summer, the tapestries faded, and at every minute, the kind of the tops reflected something different, and birds interacted with the sculptures, and people. There were 6. I also brought in some of the sculpture that I'd been making. I call them phala because phala means fruit in Sanskrit, and it's more about a sense of fertility and like a future prosperity. That sort of is what I was thinking about with these.
What happened with rain?
So, they would just dry. The tapestries themselves were treated with I'm forgetting what it's called now, but it's a substance that you treat sails with on sailboats, so that
Mm.
um, they sort of whisk off water. They're like water resistant. And these, I think these were treated too, but I actually can't remember. But yeah, they would just get wet and then dry, and get heavier and dry, and
I was
uh,
thinking about the weight for
yeah,
these.
yeah, no. And these were hung under the trees. So I think the direct sort of the water sort of directed a little bit away from them, but they definitely had weight.
Mhm. And then with the mirror surface, I
Mhm.
mean, direct light on that could cause quite the reflection or
Yeah,
fire.
yes.
How
And
did that work?
there
That was,
were
you said it was like a stainless steel mirror.
yeah, it was mirrored stainless steel. And I worked with a fabricator to create these uh lovely armatures. And we did tests in this, outside with the at the studio, to see what would happen at different angles. And I think because they were angled in a certain way, and because of their scale, it was fine. But I see your point.
No, it's interesting. It's like because, especially being by the river, how did you find like what defined the forms of the
Yes,
6 larger pieces? Could you
I
give us one of the images so we can see it when you're
sure.
like, yeah.
Here. I wanted them to have this sort of feeling of continents, but to not actually be continents.
Mm.
More like just these organic forms that might actually have fit together, almost like a pie, and then had separated. And so that they seemed like they might have been excavated, either dropped or excavated.
And were they hollow?
Yes, they're hollow. Yeah.
And then there was a performance that you did with them, wasn't there?
Yes, I was going to get there.
Mm.
I met this wonderful dancer um, in LA actually, but she lives in New York, and she's a performer, an amazing performer. And she and I collaborated, and she had 3 performances over the summer where she interacted. She choreographed Kathak dancing with a twist through and in reaction to the sculptures.
Mm.
I Sadly, I don't have a picture of her. Name is Barka Patel, and I don't have a picture of her.
Mm.
I also had a kind of billboard that was there, but I think that it was a really wonderful experience for me, just in the sense of the kind of interaction that it got, and that that people were able to really, I would see people touching them or sitting by them, using them for shade, all these things. So, in that regard, it felt very much, sort of a a communal experience.
And I guess because Socrates is the kind of place where people come because it's a park by the river as much as for the art, or they may come and not be an art audience.
Exactly.
You find it was a different group of people?
Yes, it was a combination, really a combination of just everyday park users and families and people, running by the river, etc. And then also people would come specifically to see, knowing that Socrates has sculpture and installations. So it's very much a combination, and that's something that was really, really exciting to me.
Mhm. So the experience of working outdoors in Sharjah in relation to outdoors at Socrates, you said that you recycled those. Are you now thinking that these objects are kind of objects in their own right, or do you think about how those saris will be recycled, having been what did you said like some of them are less kind of old than or worn than others
Well, what
because of
happened? Yeah, depending on the angle, uh, in relation to the sun, they'll fade either, more or less. And I love the faded ones. I think that that sense of time is just more pronounced when some are more faded than others.
Mhm.
The structures for these were actually made to be flat packed so that they could travel
Mhm.
easily. And so it's very much something that yeah,
So you'd like to see it
they'd like
again
to
in other
travel. Yeah,
situations.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. Um, so yeah, that's Socrates that opened in May with many performances and an opening in June. So the second solo exhibition uh, was called um, She Walked in Reverse and Found Their Songs. And this exhibition I had been thinking about for a couple of years with the team there. And I basically, many, many years ago in a class with Terry Adkins and in grad school, we read, I think it was The Medieval Craft of Memory. And I was always so struck by this idea of the memory palace. And so this whole exhibition centered on the idea of memory and how it plays in storytelling. So it's very autobiographical, but and also stories about ancestors. These are sort of more specific. This show was more specifically related to kind of personal stories. And I started thinking about how do we preserve those stories? How do we tell those stories? How do we archive those stories? Of my family, of people, my grandmother couldn't read or write. Everything was just told. Everything was just communicated orally. And they were, all of my grandparents were great storytellers, all the ones I knew. But when I started thinking about this exhibition, I thought of this house and this really impenetrable house. It was always going to be impenetrable because there's when you're trying to grasp at memories when you were a child of people that you loved, and they're always fleeting. And I wanted the house to be this sort of repository in a way that a memory palace is, but to also be inaccessible in a way, but to also have these allusions to India and to the past. So um, that was sort of the main, sort of the grounding point of the exhibition.
And the
I called
still?
it. Oh yeah, so in Guyana, many of the homes are on stilts, and so my grandparents' house was on stilts, and so I wanted to have that as an element. And of course, the ICA is just a wonderful, experimental space, and so all of this work was commissioned new, just like Socrates, and it was a wonderful, wonderful experience, both of those. So this shot.
So
This
again,
is
what's the
another
scale of that?
of this work or the
Happy's
oh,
house.
Happy's house is about oh boy, 18 feet, maybe 20 feet by 10 feet or 12 feet, something like that, in that range. Um,
And
uh,
how did you decide? Sorry,
no, please.
um, thinking about these kind of forms that are almost like boats as well as palaces, thinking back to that salt piece, um, in relation to this, it's like this you say is the kind of is the memory house and is a lot more personal, but I can see correlations with these kind of because this could almost be a boat.
Yes, yes. It's funny that you say that. I think for me, since growing up as Guyanese, I think there's always a sort of hearkening and desire and longing to have a kind of homeland. And I think Guyana, of course, is one, but India is another. And uh, basically, the hold on one second. Sorry about that. Yeah, basically, in thinking about boats and, of course, palaces, homes, all of these things are a way to kind of um, bring one back, bring me back to that sort of those places.
Mm.
Uh,
And then the imagery on it, like the decisions as to it's because this obviously isn't a replica of Pappy's house.
no, no, it's more of how I remember it. And I knew that it was going to be this sort of form that could somehow generate the image of what these homes in Guyana were like.
Mm.
But I also knew that I wanted an interior space to be in conversation with it. And so I wanted to create an environment that took some of that colonial furniture. And then I can show you some details. That took the furniture and I wanted the space to be a domestic space, but a ream where there was a sense of play and a sense of associations that could be made by a kind of undoing. So, the furniture again refers to some sort of colonial era, sorry. And then I've taken them apart. I've added soft sculpture and found objects to them and created a wallpaper of woven tapestry. And, the environment becomes a kind of topsy-turvy, imaginative scape. But to me, it's this sort of liminal space, a space in between where things can be undone, memory can be undone, and then also rebuilt in a way. And then the portals, I used video. I was able to travel strangely from across the Indian Ocean and across the Atlantic, as I mentioned, and uh, on a boat, on a ship. And I took a lot of video as I did that because it was really retracing the passage, the transatlantic passage, and that video is what is in the portals.
And can you explain because it's hard to see on this photograph? Ah, there you go. So there are portals in the wallpaper
Yeah, they're videos.
that are okay.
Mhm.
And that trip, so when did you do that trip?
I did it 2012. Sorry, 2012. Mhm. Mhm.
Okay, so what tell us the story of that.
It's not glamorous. The story is not glamorous. I taught on a program called Semester at Sea, and it was a way for our family to travel and see the world with, no expense.
So you started where and ended up where?
So that we did it twice actually, because we were
Wow.
sort of we would I'm a very private
Feeling.
person, but living on a ship with you know, a lot of people wasn't my thing necessarily, but that's a testament to how much we love to travel the world because we were willing to do that twice. So the first time, I think we left from Florida and then went the first time we actually went up the Amazon to Manaus and then across, and we went to Ghana and we went to South Africa. We went around the whole world. And the
Wow.
second time was more of an Atlantic exploration. So it was through Europe and then across to Rio and whatnot.
And you ended up where?
At the end,
Yeah.
or
Did you make it to
uh,
Guyana, or was it not? It doesn't go to
we went to northern Brazil, but we didn't go to Guyana. No,
like.
no, no, no. It would have been much more poetic. It would be much more poetic if we did.
But what do you teach at sea? What's the teaching at sea?
It's a full semester. It used to be run at the time by the University of Virginia.
Hmm.
And so, you know, it would be, I taught painting, I taught drawing. It was quite the challenge.
Amazing. And then you took these videos as you were
Yeah,
going.
yeah. I collected video because I knew, I mean, it was just just, I don't know, so emotive to be able to have that experience.
So 10 years later, they appear in,
They
what,
appear
12 years later, they're in the ICA San Francisco.
indeed, along with the saris worn by women in India.
Mhm.
And, you know, in addition to the weaving of the saris, I just wanted to include a work that is, this one is probably, I'm trying to remember, maybe like 80 inches by like 100 and something. But you know, I bead and embroider and all those things I learned as a child become, you know, a very big part of the practice as well.
Do you have
So
close-ups of those beads or not? Is there a way
I,
of zoom?
I don't in the I don't in this PowerPoint. I'm so sorry.
Yes.
But they all have so this is the other an anecdote, but my mom still lives in New Jersey and she collects a lot of her friends' saris and outfits for me, and then also goes to the local kind of Goodwills and collects things for me because she lives in a town that is I think I read somewhere that Edison, New Jersey has the biggest South Asian population in all of America right now. And so she collects things and sends them to LA for me. And so, like, for example, the sari pieces on the left and right are her best friend's wedding. It's parts of her best friend's wedding, sorry.
Mm.
And so having these sort of personal elements just make the stories more interesting for me and hopefully for others.
Mhm.
So the third exhibition is called Bodies and Souls, and it's in um, Tampa at the Tampa Museum of Art. And again, I had been talking to Joanna, the curator there for some time, and we, you know, being so close, of course, to the Caribbean, the emphasis on this particular exhibition was on that sort of journey, the migration story. And this piece is called Bodies and Souls, which is the name of the exhibition as well. And I sewed together, you know, dozens and dozens of found tops that my mom had sent, children's clothing and adult women's clothing as well. This work was also for this exhibition. It's called An Offering. And I didn't put in the detail, but it's their arms, they're like soft sculpture arms that are coming out. And I wanted it to have the sense of ancestry and ritual. And yeah.
So the arms are coming out in that line in the bottom where you can see the gold kind of loopings. Is that right?
Yes, the arms are coming out and holding those garlands, which are often used in rituals as well.
And what kind of arms are they? Are they like mannequin arms?
No, they're stuffed. We made them.
Oh, you made them. Okay.
They're soft sculpture. And so it's weaving and found saris and source saris and fabric, and then yeah, and trim and whatnot.
And how is it that you, if you go
Sorry.
to both of these last two, when you start, have you already planned everything out? You know exactly how the colors are going to work. You know the kind of shapes and the patterns, because this one is very like a butterfly. The one before is this kind of pouring out from a frame. Do you just have the kind of, that's the basic concept, now I'm going to go for it and see what happens, or is everything meticulously like worked out beforehand?
No, I'm impulsive, and I really value the power of intuition in as a part of my process. And so, you know, I have visions like all artists, and I kind of trust sometimes in those. So I might have an overarching kind of let's say morphology or form, and then I allow sort of this kind of spirited making to kind of take over. You know, I might plan in terms of color, like I might say, okay, I want the color to be like in this work, the denser in the center, and then it spreads and becomes more neutral. But yeah, I try to keep the planning. I mean, I have assistants, so when I'm working with others, it has to be more planned, because you can't just say like two sentences and then you know, it
Yeah,
appears.
because the scale is vast. It's not
Yeah,
like
yeah, exactly. And so, um, you know, it depends on the work. I think that some have been, Socrates was very planned, for example, because I didn't say this, but each pod had two colors, and the next pod picked up that one of those colors and then blended with another, and then the same thing, as so it was a cycle, kind of a cycle thing. So some things are very controlled. I think the way I make best, I guess, is when I let myself sort of have that, you know, giving over self.
So just go back to the one before, because this is very different. This has got kind of more, it's less woven, isn't it? It's more,
This one is not woven. It's all tops that have been hand stitched together,
right.
and skirts and saris and whatnot. And then the third, so this is a survey. Most of the work in this exhibition was selected over the last 4 or 5 years, but this is new, and an offering was 2024, the one I just showed you, and then this one as well.
All right, what's going on here?
So this one, if you want to think of the boat, oh, there's a lot of boat things going on here. I wanted to kind of think about, for this exhibition, and in general, what has been going on in my mind lately is just how do we create this world that we want to live in? And I think that it needs to have a kind of new mythology and a new sense of folklore. And how do we change that is what I've been thinking about a lot. And, you know, mythology, it basically captures a kind of collective consciousness, and, you know, what we fear, what we love, what we desire, etc. And so in order to sort of change those things for us in the present and the future, I feel as though we have to create new characters that tell different stories. And so I took a Devi, a goddess, a Hindu goddess, or a kind of generalized Hindu goddess, and then also a Diana, you know, from Greek mythology. And then within all the sort of sections that hang are woven saris and grass. And to me, it becomes almost like a space where, or something that you could travel on. I don't know if it's a boat or if it's a, you know, it's like some vehicle, if you will. But I wanted to have these like materials that were very much of the Caribbean, that felt that they were of the Caribbean. And then I just
Incredible.
showing. this because you know, I basically make work that's like this big all the way to, you know, 50 feet, etc. And it's very important to me to sort of have the ability to make in that all those different scales. Because I think, again, if storytelling is at the heart, it's always about how best to tell the story. And it's not always something that's large or something that's this material or that material. Uh, yeah. So
There's a question that's been brought from the audience. Are the Saras from India or from Guyana or other Indo-Caribbean diaspora countries?
so they are mostly from India and from North India, where my family is from. And then they are also from New Jersey and sort of family and friends. So there's sort of a mixture. I have used ones from Guyana as well. Those have mostly been from my mom and our own family. And yeah, so they're from all over. But the bulk of them are from India.
And so this piece just before, this is a found, is this something you came across and it then inspired you to do this, or did you seek it
Yeah.
out?
No. I came upon and I knew that I wanted to bead and whatnot on it.
So this is a canvas that then has that beading, the kind of red and the boats.
The
You've beaded
boats
it with
and the
the boat.
blue and the bindies and the trim and whatnot. Yeah. It's kind of like a kind of what do you call it? Interventions that happen within these works. And then the last exhibition is called Myth from Matter. So the Tampa exhibition and this one are still up. This one is up till January 12th. And actually also the ICA exhibition is traveling to the Seattle Asian Art Museum in April. So we'll see, you know, what I'm kind of curious to see how things change because I've never had a traveling exhibition. So I'm kind of curious to see how, you know, what changes, how it's received, et cetera, et cetera. So the last exhibition, basically it's called Myth from Matter. And it's in DC at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And I had an idea to basically borrow works from the various museums that are there. And so I went through the kind of collections of like every museum that made sense and picked
Wait,
out
what do you mean every museum? You mean
like all the museums in DC that made sense in relation
apart
to
from
my work.
Smithsonian? Which
Everything from like
Smithsonian?
furniture, you know, the Smithsonian, the National Gallery of Art, the, you know, the Asian Art Museum, et cetera, and picked out objects. And then they were so kind to get some loans for me, not all of them, obviously, but some of them. And what I wanted was to kind of have this like poetic undoing. And again, in relation to making this new mythology, it's really like we're in a stage of undoing, you know, undoing and rebuilding. And I thought to myself, there are not a lot of exhibitions where you might find an Indian miniature painting next to, you know, a Louise Bourgeois. And so I thought to myself, okay, let's mix it up. Let's see so let's see what happens. And so again, this is a survey. All the work is from the last few years. And yeah, I can show you some photos. So the main tapestry there is called A Cosmic Awakening. I think it was, I'm very happy that it was placed there because I feel as though the whole exhibition is about a kind of reawakening. And so there's that. And then on the pillars, these are pillars that are structural. And they're Yakshi figures that I've been using a lot in my work for the last number of years. And these ones are cast with plaster and salt as well. It's a detail of that, or large.
So just go back for 1 second. It's beautiful.
Thank you. I'm just going to flip through some of the works in here. This is an installation that I made for the Kohler Arts Center a couple years ago, and it also has video of the Atlantic Ocean on the top. and it's woven on the outside and then braided on the inside. So there's a different experience, and it has a very kind of womb-like experience when you enter.
And that's suspended.
Yes.
So it hangs from the ceiling and just hangs down. It's not supported at the bottom. Is that weaving, or does it have like a structure in it, like the?
It's just a ring. It's just a ring from which it hangs. Mhm. And it's interesting how works change from environment to environment. At the Kohler Art Center, the ceilings were like, 30 feet high. And so it was on a plinth and then raised. And it was very, very tall. And here, but it's tall enough for I can't, maybe it's 10 feet, the entrance now, or 8 feet. So I think there's just some installation shots. I've been making these figurative sculptures that are all uh, braided saris, and the colors sort of shift and the width of the sari braiding shifts, so that by the time you get to the top, there's like very intimate sort of detailing. So I had created this work, the work on the right in the back, and it's a reworking of a needlepoint. And the needlepoint is based on The Girl Reading by Fragonard. And so we were able to get the National Gallery of Art loaned us the Fragonard, and the conversation was just kind of interesting. This is the most direct relationship, I would say. These are just some other works for, and that's the Louise Bourgeois legs hanging on the right, and some of my sculpture and paintings.
So where does the Louise Bourgeois come from?
Like, why did I, where is it from?
What museum is it in?
I think it was the National Gallery of Art. Yeah.
So they gave you your freedom to.
Yeah. I mean, I was so excited. And just the idea of being able to make associations that are new uh, felt very exciting to me. And Louise Bourgeois is one of my favorite artists. So
This is the new museum, right?
this is it's a new museum. Yeah, it's the new
When did it actually open? It was like 2 years ago.
no. This is they redid it. So it opened last September, I believe, reopened.
You're one of
But
the
it's been
first
around for like 30 years or more. Yeah.
in the redoing. You're one of the first exhibitions.
Yes. It's been a year.
How did they find you?
I'm not sure. I think they said they knew my work before, but there was a show called Women to Watch that reopened the museum. And that was artists from various states. And I was a woman to watch in Colorado because I was still there. But they said they came across my work, and yeah, the timing was right to give me an exhibition.
Yes.
And this is the last exhibition. So I make collages with found materials as well. And so those are in relation to some Indian miniature paintings and folk paintings as well from the Asian Art Museum. We're very generous. And this is a new sculpture. It was just at the ADA, and I put it in just because it's one of the last things to come out of my studio, and I like her very much.
So with this, I mean, with all the works, the titles, can you say a little bit about those? Because they're extremely poetic and they
Yes,
seem to be intentional, and yet they're
yeah.
not, they don't point to a specificity.
Yes, I think there was a period of time where I didn't really use titles very much. And I feel as though if I wait till the work is finished, generally, or it's in progress, but almost there. And then the words kind of just, I focus and the words kind of just like come to me. But I feel like the words, I want them to be poetic. I want them to be an entry. And of course, as a visual artist, I don't have a verbal equivalent for the visual, but I want to have this sort of poetic entry into the sphere of the work. So those come very intuitively as well.
And so does it feel, and by the way, people, if you want to ask, we've got a few more minutes left, so put the questions in the Q&A if you have any, and I'm going to keep going because I always have questions. Does it fit in terms of directions now? It's like, it feels like there's been a complete whirlwind. You're very, as you say, you're very intuitive. You move through, you have a new studio now. This kind of figuration has come in and out of your practice a lot. All the various ways that you work comes in and comes out. It's not like anything is a kind of new way of working, or is it? Kind of, where are you at?
I think to me, this is a new way of working, but I think like all artists, it's new in the sense of like how I'm using the materials. There's still saris that are braided. The figuration for me has often remained in sort of mixed media paintings and collages, and sometimes in the tapestries. And so this idea of creating these figures in movement in a sense of transformation, they're not in one, dance pose or another. They're sort of again, becoming this idea of a kind of impermanence is something relatively new. But again, it's like they're different stories, and I think whatever medium makes sense for telling a particular story is what I will use. So to me, it's new, but as figuration, no. In this process, yes.
There's a question from Heidi. Indo-Caribbean voices and stories have been underrepresented in recent times. Do you feel that this is a resurgence or rediscovery of these stories, i.e. Museum of London's recent feature exhibition, major exhibitions in New York, etc.?
Yeah, I think that there are so many underrepresented stories, and I think that having the opportunities to share them is wonderful. I hope that it's in terms of access and in terms of platforms, I hope they remain for people all over the world, and that it's not what's trending or what's, I think again, all these voices, everybody's voice should be heard. And yes, there are opportunities right now for Caribbean artists and people, and it's wonderful. But again, I hope it's not a trend.
I think that it's incredible the kind of range that you've shown us. But to find details and things like that, I want to tell everybody that you have a website. What's the name of your website? Because then it's easier to see some of the details rather than the kind of zoom.
Sorry, yes, I should have probably shared some more details.
But like, to give this kind of overview is really good, and like learning about different ways that you think. That's the point to the conversation round table. But it's like, so the website is just your name.
It's my name, art.com.
So
Suchitra.art.com.
So one last question. We're at 6:01. How do you, like, in terms of commissioning or like doing these kind of surveys, it's like, is there something that you really want to be thinking through in terms of exhibition making next?
Yes, I think my mind, this is one of the things, but having activated the sculptures at Socrates with dance, I've been thinking strangely about performance, and I'm not again, I'm not I don't know if it'll be me doing something with performance, but maybe designing or thinking about performance in relation to the work.
Super interesting. Well, thank you very much for sharing, so much about your practice and kind of going into detail about those 4 shows. I want to thank everybody who joined us at this stage of the presentation, and for the curatorial students, see you in the other Zoom.
Thank you
Thank you.
so much for having me. Thank you, and to you all.